Okay, our next speakers are Dan Dupont and Thomas Baglole. So Thomas is a professional forester with experience spanning across sustainable forest management, carbon markets, and more. He's president of Eastern Forest Solutions, a company focused on providing value to forest owners across the Maritimes and supporting transition to climate-smart ecological forestry that sustains ecosystems, economies, and communities. Thomas and his wife Kate and their two sons live in Charlottetown and have a nice woodlot in Hazel Grove. Some of us were out to see it there last fall. Thomas joined the PEI WOA in 2020, and he represents us on the Canadian Forest Owners, an organization with over 450,000 private woodlot owners across Canada. And Dan is a professional forester who has practiced forestry in most of Canada and Finland over the past 25 years, the last of 6 of which have been on the island as Working Forest PEI. Is your name of your company, Dan? Working Forest PEI? With the exception of convincing his wife to marry him, his most recent achievement has been in acting as president of the newly formed Sustainable Forest Alliance Cooperative. So this is the genesis of this organization. Occurred in 2018 at a meeting led by former Premier Pat Binns about the future of forestry on PEI. And since then, a group of forest owners has worked diligently with Dan to create an organization that could offer the best value proposition for all forest owners. Please welcome Dan and Thomas.
Hello everybody. What a year. What about the last 5 years? Ever since we met with Pat Binns, we've had to deal with a worldwide pandemic, and we had Fiona, and now finally I'm happy, I'm very glad to announce the launch of our new Sustainable Forest Alliance. It's been a long time in the works, and it's happening today. So what I'd like to do today is briefly introduce to you the Sustainable Forest Alliance, what our relationship is with Woodlot Owners Association, why a cooperative model works, and for that matter, why a non-for-profit. And lastly, our vision. We are first and foremost a member-serving organization. If you own forest land, we're here to serve you. Our mission is to work with island forest owners to increase the value of their forests by promoting sustainable forest management and encouraging forest conservation. Reason for that is if we don't, to coin Donald's words earlier, if we don't attribute a value to our forests, they're going to be looked at as farmland and development land in waiting. We need to increase the value of our forest. And the goal is to develop a long-term relationship with a landowner and a long-term forest management strategy. And by doing so, we will work diligently to create a continual source of income for you through eternity. What is our relationship with the Woodlot Owners Association? Last year, we signed a memorandum of understanding between both organizations. The Woodlot Owners Association is very clearly advocates for forest owners at large. We provide a technical service and offer fair access to carbon and timber markets. The relationship has to be absolutely transparent and collaborative. Our members, our board members are John Cooper, Russ Compton, Robert McLean, and myself, and we are all members of the Woodlot Owners Association. We support you wholeheartedly. And through this cooperation, we'll be able to The idea is to offer the maximum value to forest owners as possible. So where does the member relationship begin? How do you get a hold of us, and how can we be of service to you? The easiest and the only way really to do so is to apply online to our new website, or peiforest.ca. And I'll take the opportunity to introduce the happy character, lovely bearded man sitting at our table, Jesse Argent. He is our program coordinator. He will be in touch with you. It'll be through email or a phone call. Next thing is, we would like to walk or cruise your property. We would like to do this with you, if at all possible. Owning forest is generally a deliberate act, unless it's multi-generational, but owning a forest is something you do deliberately. And you have hopes and dreams and goals with your forest. We would like to work with you on that, to make that happen. We have access to contractors, we have access to expertise. We'd love to work with you. Once we walk the land with you, if possible, we're going to collect data. We're going to cruise a lot. We're going to collect species and timber data. And then after that, we will write a management plan, if you haven't already got one written through the FEP. The forest management plan we're going to write is going to be, in fact, through the Forest Enhancement Program. And at that point, we're going to review the plan with you, and we're going to discuss options. Sustainable forest harvesting, conservation, if you'd like to embark on a carbon project, or maybe you'd like to do all three. That's entirely up to you. But forest management doesn't always equal harvesting. We need to conserve forest, and we're openly willing to work with government on achieving their 7 or 10% conservation lands. And last but not least, we will be collaborating on your behalf with Island Nature Trust, the Federation of Agriculture, the Woodlot Owners Association, and the Department of Environment, Energy, and Climate Action. And at this time, I'd like to give a special shout out to the Scott's department and Mike's Department of Forestry and the Office of Net Zero. If it wasn't for them, we would not be here, very basically. Now, why a cooperative model? I'm going to answer this by giving you a little story. In 2016, 2017, I took a contract term of work in Finland, a little community called Lanua. It's actually right at the Arctic Circle. I wanted to work there because I heard rumblings of these world-class, highly productive forests so close to the Arctic Circle. I wanted to work in them, and boy did I ever. There is not an acre on Finland that is not managed. Very little understory, very perfectly well spaced. To some people, it's the most productive forest on earth. To others, they're vertical deserts. Doesn't matter. This is what works for the Finns. But what really surprised me was the society, the culture of Finns. Extremely collaborative. Everybody works as a community. They work together. In fact, there are more cooperative members in Finland than there are citizens. That means that every citizen of Finland is a member of at least 4 cooperatives. And it blew my mind, so I couldn't speak very good Finn at the bars, so I bought the book. And I read on it. What was this whole cooperative approach? What was its genesis? And it started with this gentleman called Hannes Gerhard. In the late 1800s, Finland had a neighbor, Russia. They were very threatening, they were very oppressive on the Finns. They controlled absolutely everything that went in and out of the country, to the point where the Finns were destitute, they were starving to death. And in comes Hannes, and he started encouraging communities to work together, to trade amongst each other. And I mean, within 30 years, they had everything. They had dairies, sawmills, pharmacies, grocery stores, you name it, everybody traded together. There was no need to export or import anything. They were absolutely self-sufficient. And we see the result of this now in 2020. They're absolutely phenomenal. But the one quote they have at their parliament in Helsinki, they have a picture of Mr. Hannes Gerhard, and with a quote underneath it. And this quote really affected me. It was the man in 1899 explaining to the Finns what a cooperative association would look like, what it would do. And he said, "A cooperative is the peaceful endeavor of the underprivileged to improve their lot by their own effort, joined together." Now, I'm not in any way, shape, or form insinuating that islanders are underprivileged. But as a forest industry, we are disadvantaged. Everything we cut, everything we do has to get hauled off island. We've become experts at exporting jobs, carbon, and a good chunk of our economy. I've just about had enough of it as a contractor here, and I've been listening to, I have about 12,000 acres of clients I work with. Very difficult at some stages, especially now, to work fairly with a landowner, especially based on rates. The impetus behind the SFA is to create this industry on PEI. Now, our vision is through a definition of our definition of what a cooperative is. Cooperatives are based on the idea that those who own and or use a resource, the members, should also own and govern it. Cooperative members decide to produce, how to do it, and what to do with the profits. The goal is to make businesses truly accountable to those they claim to serve. That is our mantra. Number one, for the SFA and for us to succeed, is to grow our membership. Once we grow our membership, we grow our land base. Once we have a forest base, we now have a voice. Once we have that voice, we quantify our resource, not specifically just in timber value, but in hectarage of forest. I'm not insinuating again that it should all be harvested sustainably. A lot of these forests should be conserved. We've got some gorgeous, gorgeous wetlands and old growth forests. We've got no business in there. But once we quantify this resource and we have a large enough land base and we have enough membership, I hope to do this very soon, but we can develop a sustainable member-owned industry. And only at that point can we start even discussing, whispering to each other, my God, can we actually build our own sawmill? Can we have a kiln? Imagine if we could treat our own wood. Imagine going to Kent looking for 12 2x4s and having to sift through 50 of them before you get something decent. Imagine being able to use your own wood off your own forests. That's what we see. And it's only possible with you, and we are here to serve you.
So, I guess Dan is kind of the visionary guy that started the organization, and I joined recently as a consultant through my company Eastern Forest Solutions to help get it off the ground, and really start working with woodlot owners that want to join this organization. So, what does the SFA do for you? Dan kind of explained it on a high level, but essentially a woodlot owner just decides to join an organization like the Sustainable Forest Alliance. I wish I had a clicker. That would make this a lot easier. And then, as we discussed, this entire organization would not exist if it were not for the Forest Enhancement Program. So the funding streams associated with that for the development of a sustainable management plan, as well as for the implementation of the work that gets done on member woodlots. So as I said, what flows out of out of the program, the Forest Enhancement Program, is a forest management plan. What flows out of the forest management plan is obviously forest management. So this is the harvesting of wood. So or the conservation of forests for different values. What we'll also be looking at, as you saw some of the partners that Dan mentioned, such as Island Nature Trust, to try and have a robust conservation strategy on each individual woodlot, as well as on the woodlots as a whole across the membership. And then as we're on that woodlot, we're going to be taking some information, so measuring some trees, and that'll help us to think about something like carbon, how much carbon is in that woodlot. And what that does is, some of the stuff that Donald touched on earlier this morning, allow us to think about something like markets and value. So what flows out of forest management is markets. So the Sustainable Forest Alliance, similar to the way that the province sells wood, will help landowners to do something such as tendering harvest blocks, as well as forest carbon. So thinking about, the reason a cooperative exists is for landowners to join together towards something bigger. So that allows you to do something like aggregate multiple landowners into a forest carbon project. So I think everyone kind of understands forest management, and I'm not going to give what's called kind of forest carbon 101 or carbon markets or carbon projects 101. I'll just kind of, I guess, if people have ever had interested in carbon or carbon projects, I'm sure you've maybe read about it or thought about it. So I'm going to skip kind of some of the really high-level terminology and just start to explain, how we could do this as the Sustainable Forest Alliance on behalf of members. So that figure, I don't know how well you can read it, but essentially the bottom circle is what's called a project. So as Donald said, agriculture will be a different project, and forests will be a different project. They might be on the same what's called registry, so that's about 3 circles up, but they have to be distinct projects with a whole bunch of work that's done in the background to get that off the ground. But the intermediary in between the registry and the project is obviously a developer. So that's where the Sustainable Forest Alliance and Eastern Forest Solutions are partnering. And then you have markets. So I might be able to show like a website, but I'm going to explain a project called Pivot. It's out of Quebec, and they have a beautiful website that they use to entice buyers to come and invest in conserving these forests. I think, for example, the Federation of Agriculture and the Sustainable Forest Alliance will be able to offer buyers a whole of Prince Edward Island conservation approach to buying our carbon, conserving our landscape, helping the province achieve net zero, and everything in between. Forest carbon projects, as with all carbon projects, rely on what's called a baseline scenario and a project scenario. And essentially that baseline scenario is, why does this project need to exist, and what would this landowner do in the absence of that project? Well, essentially, I guess the term is a counterfactual. And that baseline scenario on Prince Edward Island is, a landowner, as Mike alluded to, will grow spruce fir and clear cut it on a 40 to 45 year cycle, and that's the carbon calculation that average landowner would do, and they would be economically incentivized to do. And then you estimate the project scenario. So when you start the project, the baseline scenario is set in stone for a number of years, up to a decade or more. And then the project scenario you can change on an annual basis. So you can decide to fluctuate your harvesting over time and your storage of carbon over time. The general type of forest carbon projects, that you can actually do. So there's one called improved forest management. So that's what I explained first, is you take a forest, it's managed a certain way, and you manage it a different way to store and sequester more carbon on that landscape. The second one, and I think this one might have some applicability for people in the agricultural community, is you take land that's under threat of conversion to alternative land use. And again, your counterfactual, your baseline in that scenario is the land has trees on it, it no longer has trees, and I'll show in a little bit, and you get compensated for the amount of carbon you store beyond what you would have done in the absence of the project. And then afforestation. This is taking land that is currently unforested or degraded and planting trees on it. And in this situation, in North America, improved forest management projects, I would say, are the most common. So afforestation, essentially the land's too expensive to justify planting trees on. Avoided conversion, Primarily, I guess, a lot of land that was going to be cleared in North America has already been cleared, but Prince Edward Island has some unique characteristics in that case. But really, we will be focusing primarily on IFM. You know, the province through the 2 Billion Trees program has afforestation covered pretty well, and there might be some opportunities to work on that, but generally speaking, it's not the avenue we're pursuing. So, beyond high-level descriptions about projects, we'll move on to the types of projects that the Sustainable Forest Alliance is currently considering. So as you remember back to that figure with all the circles, there was one called registries. And the registries, they have what are called methodologies or protocols. And essentially these are the rules that says this is what a baseline is and this is what a project is. And then all these complicated calculations and models that occur in the background, and that comes up to a number of credits that you create. So the one on the left is called the Improved Forest Management on Canadian Forest Lands. I know of some projects in development using this, but there's none actually listed on the registry yet for the American Carbon Registry. So that was released in September 2021. I'm not sure how well everyone can read that. And then the one in the middle is the Verified Carbon Standard, or VERA is the name of the registry. And that's the Canadian Forest Carbon Offset Methodology. So we're going to look at the Pivot project, as I said, in Quebec, as well as there's a number of projects ongoing. There's a lot of German investors buying land in New Brunswick, and they're implementing projects using this methodology. And those are two, as Donald spoke to earlier, that's a voluntary carbon market. So the buyers of those offsets are not legislated to buy those offsets by any government. But on the right there, this is not the methodology, but it's some documentation from the federal government. And the federal government of Canada, through a series of, I guess, convoluted policies and regulations related to the carbon tax, essentially, are working on an improved forest management on private lands protocol or methodology that would allow the Sustainable Forest Alliance to create carbon credits to sell in the compliance market in Canada. And that should be released this summer and for public review, and then the capacity to list projects through the federal government's federal GHG offset system will exist, hopefully, in the next year. So that's very technical, a lot of stuff, but I hope it's kind of coming together for people. Delving into, I guess, two specific projects. Again, I have no compliance ones to show because none exist in Canada. You could look to California to look for some of those. But we'll look at one on the VERA registry, and then we'll look at one on the American Carbon Registry. And these are two, I guess, that we might take some insights from as we work towards developing our own. So I've touched on the Pivot one a lot because it's in Quebec. They've got a nice logo, they're marketing, they have a nice kind of presence online, and they're working with buyers to entice people to pay top dollar for these offsets. It's led by a company, EcoTierra. They're local to Quebec. They've done a lot of their work in, I guess, developing nations historically up to this point. They're working with various aggregators. So this is primarily in southern Quebec, and these are forestry cooperatives. So the Sustainable Forest Alliance in this context is the aggregator. Eastern Forest Solutions is the developer, similar to that. And they're looking to enroll 15,000 hectares in 5 years. I would say the Sustainable Forest Alliance is much more, we have higher aspirations than that, but we have objectives, for acreage to get this started in the first year at least. And the cool thing that I kind of spoke to about that middle methodology is you can have multiple activity types. So they have some landowners, the conservation groups that are rolling land into this project that are doing what's called log to protected. And this is just, it helps with the calculations of how many credits you would get per acre. There's also extended harvest cycles. Instead of harvesting on a 40-year rotation, you harvest on a 60-year rotation. And then they are doing some afforestation. And if you can go read all the documentation, and there's a table in the top of the documentation, and it shows roughly how many credits per acre that these projects are generating, or excuse me, it shows me the estimates of how many credits they will create, and then you divide it by the number of acres in the project, and you get an idea of how many credits per acre that a project is is going to generate, and then I to get to this number, I would just go and find some publicly available market information, which is very challenging to find, but in the voluntary market, I would think that compliance or voluntary credits would sell for, on the low end, hopefully in the 15 Canadian dollars, and in the high end, maybe the 25 or plus. So that's up to us to get the best dollar as we sell these offsets. And this would be a gross revenue that the landowner is getting. Obviously, there's costs associated with that, and I'm not privy to that for these projects. And then the second one is Cold Hollow to Canada. So this is in Vermont, similar forests, Prince Edward Island, but different management histories, as we'll kind of talk to here in a bit. It's led by the Vermont Land Trust and a group called Cold Hollow to Canada and others. That's their brand for actually the entire nonprofit, but they're marketing their credits through the conservation group. It's an aggregation of 10 landowners owning about 8,700 acres. It's kind of hard to tell, but you can see they're kind of all distributed around this mountainous area of Vermont, probably making maple syrup and whatever they do up there. A lot of the offsets have been bought by Amazon, I believe, through this project. And actually, thinking back to Pivot, they announced some of their biggest first partnership. It was actually with Keurig and Dr. Pepper, I think, are partnered together as a company, and they purchased a lot of that. So they were interested in supporting forests conservation in southern Quebec to offset some of their emissions. So speaking about, we've talked about Fiona, we've talked about where we all have an idea of how forests on PEI have been managed. I have to kind of set expectations for the fact that Vermont forests are a little bit more carbon rich than ours are at this point in time. So that project has an average stocking today of about 149 tons of CO2 per acre, and they grow about 2.5 to 3 tons of CO2 per acre per year. So that's using the biomass part of the forest is the calculations there to get that 149. And when I look at properties around the Maritimes, depends how aggressively managed they've been historically. I'd say we're closer to the 65 to 80 tons per acre, and that determines kind of some of the crediting potential up front in these projects. And then what they did, this is what we'll do a whole bunch of convoluted financial modeling and forest growth and yield modeling to come up to these numbers. And essentially, what they argue in this project is the landowner, that red line, they would draw the stocking down in that property, they would aggressively harvest it, and then in the project, they will continue to grow the inventory at some rate, so the amount of carbon in the forest. And you have to do some, you can see the differential that they showed there. So the difference are the blue lines. That's the number of, the amount of carbon stored in the forest that's different between those two scenarios. And then the project scenario, so again, I said it's kind of a preliminary estimate of what you plan to do. So for example, for the Sustainable Forest Alliance, as we get 100 landowners in a room or however we need to start a project, we would talk with each landowner. How much firewood do you remove a year? Those types of questions. We would aggregate all the landowner or the management plans that we've written on all of these properties. They'll be in computer database and in documents, and we will say who plans on thinning in 2025 or 2032, and start to think about what the project scenario theoretically looks like. And it's projected to generate about 443 sellable credits. On the American Carbon Registry, they're called emission reduction tons. For Vera, they're called VCUs, or verified carbon units. They're all fungible, like tradable amongst each other. Buyers buy some ERTs and some VCUs to put on their balance sheets to claim their emissions reductions. Voluntarily, remember that these are voluntary markets. These landowners, again, remember the caveat that I said that our forests are very different than theirs. So they get compensated for the decision not to harvest in those first 10 years, not to aggressively harvest, and then you get compensated for the growth into the future. So, how are we doing? 26 minutes, and I think we asked for 30, so we're doing okay. I'm just about to wrap this up. So what's next? So as I said, I'm on contract for this member-driven organization. They were not in the position to build out a full team of forestry professionals to work in the forest enhancement program and start doing all the work it takes to get a carbon project off the ground. So I'm hiring 2 forest technicians, young graduates from the Maritime College of Forest Technology, and we're going to be, I've owed some people a management plan for probably 2 years, and I don't have the time to do it, so these young folks will be out writing management plans, taking measurements, talking to landowners, working with the provincial technicians to figure out how to manage these different properties. As we said, rapid enrollment of member landowners into the Forest Enhancement Program and management plan development. So we hope to help the province have a push on getting those 18,000 woodlot owners, which we will never do that, but we're going to see what we can pull off. When we're on that property, we're going to be taking some measurements above and beyond what the Forest Enhancement Program expects, and we'll give each member a personalized forest carbon assessment supported by on-the-ground measurements and member-specific financial projections with some, the recognition that this is a market, it's a commodity market, so it'll show you a high end and a low end and all of the in-between for our expectations. And I was speaking with Barry the last couple of days, and the SFA we will provide to Woodlot Owner Association members a preliminary assessment as part of our pursuing this partnership between the 2 organizations. That you guys have already joined this group. If you want to know, based on data that we can find openly available, what this could look like to you, and then if you want better data, you would have to join the Sustainable Forest Alliance, and we would walk the property and do those assessments. And then you're in the organization, you're just in a traditional forestry cooperative. The main markets forestry cooperatives operate in are timber markets, and you're not committing to a carbon project the day you join the Sustainable Forest Alliance. You just have access to the information. We will probably, I'd like to have our project kind of who's joining by mid-August, September, because we have 80 to 100 days of work measuring trees in forests to do before the snow flies if we want to work on this for next year. So as I said, we'll be working on a forest carbon inventory. These are very different than the work we'll be doing on the FEP plans. We would be setting up, if anyone's ever seen a permanent sample plot, like the province has, there'd be trees measured with spray paint, there'd be a piece of rebar, and then there will be an auditor that will come and sample a certain portion of these plots to ensure that we have accurately measured the carbon in these forests. So between September to November, we will be working on that inventory piece. I'll be working in the background on some documentation to get that project listed in 2024. Then sometime verifier, so this market has grown substantially the last couple of years. There's a lot of points in that process that it could get held up. So the companies that audit, they're understaffed. So that's an issue, but again, we'll just deal with that as it comes. And then we would love to sell offsets and distribute revenues in 2024 to people that join this organization. So why join? Based on Dan's presentation, my presentation, you can work with a trusted partner to monetize your forest's role in net zero. You have access to high quality forestry advice and management services through the province's top-notch private land program, the Forest Enhancement Program. The Sustainable Forest Alliance wants to unlock the opportunity and values that landowners hold. So, I don't think every landowner needs to join the carbon project. Speaking to what Mike said, spruce fir is what drives contractor and landowner returns, generally speaking, at this point in time. But interestingly, hardwood trees are heavier if you've ever tried to lift it up. And measuring biomass and carbon in a tree is different than measuring, scaling a log. It's a weight measurement. And so hardwood forests are actually probably more economically advantageous for selling carbon. And the cool thing about that is it changes the management decisions you would make in that hardwood forest. It'll allow us to grow those big sugar maple logs. It'll allow us to draw back the amount of wood people harvest in those forests for something like 40 years, and hopefully we will have bigger trees in the future. pending, of course, hurricanes and all those things that we have to work towards adapting for. And then, so as I said, every landowner doesn't need to join the carbon project, but if the province wants to reach net zero, and every landowner, of course, we all make our own decisions, we all will continue to make our own decisions, but if some people join us that never want to do anything, some people join us that want to double down on, managing for their spruce plantation, and some people want to do light touch forestry, they all have a role to play in the landscape. And if the SFA as a aggregation can say, we've got 80 tons of CO2 per acre, we're going to harvest over here, grow over here, have habitat over here, hopefully, and we can set kind of an objective for the organization as a whole that says, in 10 years, we've got 90 tons of CO2 across our membership. And then you would start to see the difference between the membership in this organization and the rest of the forests potentially. So, to wrap it up, why join? High quality forest management. We're working hard on verified carbon projects, achieve your goals, and new market opportunities. So, as you said, as Dan said, you can go meet Jesse Argent. And then since Dan put a picture of me in his presentation, I thought I'd put a few of him. So this is part of our strategy to grow the workforce on Prince Edward Island in the forest sector. So these are my boys in Dan's machine just last weekend as he's cleaning up a red pine plantation. And I can almost guess what Dan is saying in that picture. He's probably saying, managing the Acadian forest is all about shade. So, thank you very much.